The summer of 1987 arrived in Pine Ridge, Oregon, like a postcard come to life. Evergreen forests stretched endlessly beneath cloudless skies, and the air carried the scent of wild honeysuckle mixed with the faint wood smoke from distant campfires. It was the kind of place where parents felt safe sending their children away for weeks at a time, trusting that nothing bad could happen in a town where everyone knew everyone else's name. But Pine Ridge would soon learn what every small town eventually discovers, that safety is an illusion, and darkness can take root anywhere. Camp Whispering Pines sat nestled in a valley 7 miles outside town, surrounded by dense woodland that seemed to swallow sound itself. The camp had operated every summer since 1952 without incident, building a reputation as a wholesome retreat where kids learned archery, canoeing, and how to identify constellations. Parents drove hours to drop their children off at those weathered wooden gates, confident they would return home sun-kissed and happy, with pockets full of smooth river stones and heads full of ghost stories told around crackling fires. On June 15, 1987, a silver station wagon pulled through those gates carrying Thomas and Elizabeth Hartley, 11-year-old twins from Medford, that's 2 hours south. Their mother, Janet Hartley, had saved for months to afford the camp fees, working double shifts at the textile factory to give her children an experience she never had growing up. Their father had died 3 years earlier in a logging accident, and Janet wanted desperately to give Thomas and Elizabeth something normal, something magical, something that proved the world still held wonder, despite their loss. Thomas was the quieter of the two, a skinny boy with sandy hair that fell into his eyes and a habit of sketching everything he saw in a battered notebook. Elizabeth, identical in appearance but opposite in temperament, talked enough for both of them, her laughter cutting through any silence like sunlight through trees. They were inseparable in the way only twins can be, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in looks that spoke volumes. Camp director Gerald Foster greeted them personally, his weathered face creasing into a practiced smile as he shook Janet's hand. He had run Whispering Pines for 18 years, and nothing in his manner suggested anything but competence and warmth. He showed them to Cabin 7, where Thomas and Elizabeth would sleep in bunk beds alongside 8 other campers, all roughly the same age. The cabin smelled of pine sap and old canvas, and someone had carved their initials into the windowsill years before. Janet hugged her children goodbye that afternoon, holding them perhaps a moment longer than necessary, as if some primal part of her sensed what was coming. But she climbed back into her station wagon and drove away, watching them wave in her rearview mirror until the trees swallowed them from view. It was the last time she would ever see them, and the first week passed without incident. Thomas sketched the lake at sunset, the ancient trees, the way light filtered through leaves in the early morning. Elizabeth made friends instantly, leading groups of giggling girls on unauthorized explorations just beyond the camp boundaries, always returning before anyone noticed. But counselors later reported that both twins seemed happy, adjusted, normal. There were no fights, no homesickness, no warning signs. On June 22nd, a Monday, the camp held its traditional scavenger hunt. Campers were divided into teams and sent into the surrounding forest with lists of items to find: a pine cone larger than your fist, 3 different types of moss, a feather from a blue jay, a stone shaped like a heart. The rules were simple: stay within the marked boundaries, return before the dinner bell at 6 o'clock, and always keep your partner in sight. Thomas and Elizabeth were paired together, which seemed natural given their bond. They headed north from camp at 2 in the afternoon, their voices joining the chorus of excited children fanning out into the woods. But Counselor Amy Richardson watched them go, clipboard in hand, mentally counting heads as teams disappeared between the trees. Everything seemed routine, orderly, safe. But when the dinner bell clanged across the valley at 6 o'clock, Thomas and Elizabeth did not return. At first, no one panicked. Counselors assumed the twins had wandered farther than allowed and would emerge sheepishly within minutes, perhaps with scraped knees and elaborate excuses. Amy Richardson organized a quick head count of the remaining campers, confirmed everyone else had returned, and then grabbed 2 other counselors to begin a preliminary search of the immediate area. They called the twins' names, their voices echoing through the darkening forest, expecting any moment to hear Elizabeth's distinctive laugh or see Thomas's sandy hair bobbing between the trees. By 7 o'clock, concern had hardened into genuine worry. Gerald Foster contacted the local sheriff's department, and within an hour, Deputy Martin Wheeler arrived with 3 other officers and a tracking dog. The dog picked up the twins' scent near the edge of camp, then following it northeast for roughly half a mile before losing the trail completely at a small creek that cut through the forest. It was as if Thomas and Elizabeth had simply vanished into the water and never emerged. Search parties formed throughout the night, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like desperate prayers. Volunteers from Pine Ridge arrived in pickup trucks, bringing thermoses of coffee and grim determination. They combed through underbrush, checked abandoned hunting cabins, waded through the creek calling names until their voices went hoarse. But the forest yielded nothing, no trace, no clue, no sign that 2 children had ever passed through it all. Janet Hartley received the phone call at 9:30 that night, and something inside her shattered in a way that would never fully heal. She drove through the darkness to Pine Ridge, her hands shaking on the steering wheel, her mind refusing to accept what she was hearing. This was not supposed to happen. Not here, not to her children, not after everything they had already endured. By dawn on Tuesday, the search had expanded to include state police, volunteer fire departments from 3 counties, and over 200 civilians who had heard about the missing twins on the morning news. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors chopping the air as they scanned the endless canopy below. News vans began arriving by midday, transforming the camp entrance into a circus of reporters and camera crews, all wanting the story, the tragedy, the heartbreak. But despite the resources, despite the manpower, despite the desperate urgency driving every searcher forward, the forest kept its secrets. No footprints, no torn clothing caught on branches, no dropped scavenger hunt list, nothing. It was as though Thomas and Elizabeth had been plucked from existence by an invisible hand. And theories began to circulate almost immediately, whispered between searchers during brief rest periods, muttered over static-filled police radios. Maybe they had fallen into a hidden ravine. Maybe they had been attacked by wildlife, though no ranger could recall a predator attack in these woods for decades. Maybe they had simply gotten lost and were wandering in circles, growing weaker with each passing hour. But there were darker theories too, the kind spoken only in lowered voices after children had been sent to bed. Theories about strangers watching the camp, about vehicles parked on logging roads with their lights off, about someone waiting for exactly this opportunity. Because while animals and accidents were frightening, they followed predictable patterns. What had happened to the Hartley twins followed no pattern at all. On Wednesday, search dogs picked up a scent 3 miles northeast of camp, near an old fire lookout tower that had been abandoned since the early 70s. The structure loomed against the sky, its wooden frame weathered silver gray, accessed by a rusted ladder missing several rungs. Officers climbed carefully to the top, finding a small enclosed room filled with broken glass, bird droppings and scattered beer cans from teenagers who used it as a party spot. But in the corner, underneath a pile of rotting newspapers from 1983, they found something that made veteran officers go pale. A child's shoe, small and worn, with faded purple laces. Janet Hartley identified it within minutes of seeing a photograph. It belonged to Elizabeth. The discovery transformed the investigation overnight. What had been treated as a possible lost child scenario now became something far more sinister. The FBI was contacted, agents arriving with their pressed suits and serious faces, bringing protocols designed for the worst-case scenarios that parents pray never materialize. The lookout tower became the center of the investigation, teams carefully documenting every surface, every fingerprint, every fiber that might lead them to answers. But the shoe raised more questions than it answered. How had Elizabeth's shoe ended up in that tower, 3 miles from where the twins had vanished? Had they walked there voluntarily or been taken? And if taken, where was Thomas's shoe? Where were the children themselves? Gerald Foster, the camp director, faced intense scrutiny. Officers questioned him for hours, examining his background, his relationships, his movements on the day the twins disappeared. But Foster's record was spotless, 18 years without incident, references from hundreds of parents whose children had attended his camp and returned home safely. He passed a polygraph test, and his alibi for Monday afternoon was ironclad. He had been visible to dozens of witnesses throughout the scavenger hunt. The counselors underwent similar interrogation, each one eliminated as suspects through a combination of alibis, witness testimony, and background checks. Amy Richardson, who had watched the twins enter the forest that Monday afternoon, cried during her interview, haunted by the thought that she should have kept them closer, should have sensed something was wrong. Local residents were questioned next, starting with anyone who lived within 10 miles of the camp. Pine Ridge was small enough that police knew most residents by name, but the surrounding area included scattered properties owned by people who valued isolation. Officers knocked on doors of remote cabins, interviewed hermits and homesteaders, checked hunting licenses and vehicle registrations. They found nothing concrete, only the ambient strangeness that exists in any rural community. An elderly man who claimed he had seen lights in the forest on Monday night, though he admitted his eyesight was poor and he might have imagined it. A woman who insisted she had heard children's voices near her property on Tuesday morning, though the timeline did not match and she could not say for certain it was not just the wind. Small details that led nowhere, dead ends disguised as possibilities. By Friday, 1 week after the twins vanished, the official search was scaled back. Volunteers were thanked and sent home. Helicopters returned to their bases. The news vans began migrating to newer tragedies. But Janet Hartley refused to leave. She rented a room at Pine Ridge's only motel, a sagging structure with cigarette-burned carpets and a neon vacancy sign that buzzed through the night. Every morning she drove to the camp, walking the trails herself, calling her children's names until her voice gave out, refusing to accept what everyone else was beginning to believe. The FBI continued working the case behind the scenes, expanding their search to include known predators with a 100-mile radius. They interviewed transients who had been spotted in the area, checked alibis of registered offenders, and followed leads that seemed promising at first but ultimately collapsed under scrutiny. Special Agent Victoria Brennan, assigned to lead the investigation, worked 16-hour days, her desk covered with maps and photographs and interview transcripts that refused to reveal their secrets. But as days turned to weeks, even the FBI's presence began to diminish. The other cases demanded attention, resources had to be allocated elsewhere, and without new evidence there was only so much they could do. Agent Brennan promised Janet that the case would remain open, that they would never stop looking, but the words rang hollow, sounding like the beginning of goodbye. By mid-July, Camp Whispering Pines closed for the season. Adult parents arrived to collect their children early, no longer trusting the camp that had promised safety and delivered nightmare. Gerald Foster stood at the gates watching them leave, his 18 years of reputation crumbling like the ancient wood of the lookout tower. He would never reopen the camp. The property would sit abandoned for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, and becoming the subject of local ghost stories and dares among teenagers too young to remember what really happened there. Janet Hartley returned to Medford in August, returning to the empty house where her children's beds remained made, their toys scattered across bedroom floors, their clothing still hanging in closets. She could not bring herself to pack anything away, maintaining their rooms like shrines, as if keeping everything ready would somehow summon them home. Friends and family tried to help, bringing casseroles and sympathy, but there is no comfort that reaches the depths where a mother's grief lives. The investigation officially went cold in September of 1987, though it was never formally closed. The case files sat in storage at the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department, growing thicker with reports that led nowhere, witness statements that contradicted each other, theories that sounded plausible, until examined closely. Once a month, then once every few months, then eventually just on the anniversary of their disappearance, the newspapers would run follow-up articles, asking if anyone remembered anything, if anyone had information, if anyone could solve the mystery that had haunted an entire community. But years passed, and memories faded the way memories do. New tragedies replaced old ones, and the Hartley twins became a cautionary tale rather than a living case. Parents used their story to frighten children into obedience, teenagers told spooky versions around campfires, and gradually the twins became more legend than real, two ghosts haunting a forest that had swallowed them whole. Janet Hartley never stopped looking. She spent what little money she had on private investigators who promised results and delivered disappointment. She drove to Pine Ridge every June 22nd, walking the trails herself, placing flowers at the base of the old lookout tower, but praying to a god she was no longer certain existed. She attended support groups for parents of missing children, listening to stories that mirrored her own, finding bitter comfort in shared anguish. But the twins never came home. In 1995, a hiker found skeletal remains in the forest 15 miles west of the camp. The bones belonged to a child approximately the right age, and for 3 terrible days Janet allowed herself to hope that perhaps there would finally be answers, closure, an end to the not knowing that was worse than any definitive tragedy. But DNA testing, still relatively new at the time, proved the remains belonged to a different child, a runaway from California who had disappeared 2 years before the Hartley twins, creating a new mystery that would never be solved. By the year 2000, Thomas and Elizabeth Hartley had been gone for 13 years, longer than they had been alive. Janet was 49 years old, her hair gone grey, her face carved with lines of sorrow that made her look decades older. She still worked at the textile factory, still lived in the same house, still maintained her children's rooms exactly as they had left them. People who knew her story spoke of her with pity and admiration in equal measure, they marveling at her refusal to surrender hope, while quietly believing that hope itself had become a kind of madness. Then, in the spring of 2017, 30 years after the twins disappeared, a man named Kevin Lang bought the old Camp Whispering Pines property. He was a developer from Portland with plans to build luxury vacation cabins, capitalizing on the growing trend of remote forest getaways. The land was cheap, the location was beautiful, and Kevin either did not know or did not care about the history that soaked into the soil beneath those ancient trees. Construction crews arrived in April, bulldozers tearing through underbrush that had grown wild over 3 decades. They demolished the old cabins first, rotted wood collapsing with minimal effort, revealing the stone foundations that had supported them since the 1950s. Cabin 7, where Thomas and Elizabeth had slept during their final week, fell like all the others, reduced to splinters and memories. But when workers began excavating the foundation to prepare for new construction, a shovel struck something that should not have been there. The foreman called a halt, and crew members carefully brushed away decades of accumulated dirt to reveal a metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, sealed with rusted hinges and a padlock that crumbled at the lightest touch. Inside they found a map. It was hand-drawn on yellowed paper, the ink faded but still visible, depicting the area surrounding Camp Whispering Pines in surprising detail. But it was not a typical map. Someone had marked specific locations with X symbols, over a dozen of them, scattered throughout the forest in a pattern that meant nothing to the construction workers, but would soon mean everything to investigators who had spent 30 years searching for answers. Kevin Lang, to his credit, immediately contacted the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department. The case file was pulled from storage, dusted off, and reopened. The map was photographed, analyzed, compared against topographical surveys of the area. Each X was assigned coordinates, and teams were dispatched to investigate every single location marked on that mysterious 30-year-old document. What they found would redefine everything they thought they knew about the summer of 1987, and about the children who had vanished into the forest without a trace. Because the map was not a guide to where Thomas and Elizabeth had gone. It was a guide to where they had been taken, and to the truth that had been buried beneath Camp Whispering Pines for 3 decades, waiting for someone to finally uncover it. But that truth would prove to be far darker than anyone had imagined, and the answers it provided would raise questions that still haunt the forests of Pine Ridge to this very day. The Hartley twins had not simply disappeared. They had been swallowed by something that had existed in those woods long before the camp was built, something that operated according to rules no one fully understood, then something that should never have been disturbed. And the map was only the beginning. The first X on the map led investigators to a location 2 miles east of the old camp, in a section of forest so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. Sheriff Daniel Kovacs, who had been a rookie deputy when the twins disappeared and was now leading the department, stood at the coordinates with a team of 6 officers, a forensic specialist, and a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The forest here felt different somehow, quieter than it should be, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly 3 feet below the surface, an empty space where solid earth should be. Officers began digging carefully, their shovels breaking through layers of decomposed pine needles and dark soil. Within an hour, they struck something solid. Wood, rotted but intact enough to recognize its shape. A box, roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, built from pine planks and sealed with tar that had hardened into black glass over the decades. No one spoke as they lifted it from the ground. The box was lighter than expected, and when forensic specialist Lisa Mendoza carefully pried open the lid, the smell that emerged was not decomposition but something mineral and strange, like wet stone and old metal. But inside, nestled in what appeared to be a bed of dried moss and faded cloth, they found a collection of objects that made no immediate sense. A pocket watch stopped at 4:17, its crystal face cracked in a spiderweb pattern. A child's drawing of a house with smoke curling from the chimney, the paper brittle with age. 3 marbles, the old-fashioned kind made of actual glass with swirls of color frozen inside. A tarnished silver locket containing a photograph of 2 adults from what appeared to be the 1940s, their faces stern and unsmiling. And a small leather journal, its pages filled with handwriting so faded it was almost invisible. But there were no human remains, no bones, no clothing, nothing that suggested a burial site. Just these strange artifacts arranged with an almost ceremonial precision, as if someone had created a time capsule or a memorial for reasons no one could comprehend. Sheriff Kovacs ordered the other X locations investigated immediately. Over the next week, teams excavated 11 more sites scattered throughout the forest surrounding the old camp. Each location yielded a similar box, each one containing different objects but following the same pattern. Children's toys from different eras, photographs of families no one recognized, personal items that seemed to span decades, from a fountain pen manufactured in 1938 to a digital watch from 1985, its battery long dead, and its display forever blank. But again, no bodies, no evidence of violence or burial. Just these carefully preserved collections of memories and objects, hidden beneath the forest floor like secrets the earth had been forced to keep. The discovery ignited a media firestorm that made the original Disappearance look like a footnote. News crews returned to Pine Ridge in force, their satellite trucks clogging the narrow roads, their reporters speculating wildly about what the boxes meant, what had happened here, what darkness had been lurking in these woods for generations. The camp property was declared a crime scene, yellow tape stretched between trees that had stood silent witness to mysteries no one had known to ask about. Janet Hartley, now 70 years old and living in a nursing care facility in Medford after a stroke 3 years earlier, was informed of the discovery. She could no longer walk without assistance, her left side weakened by the damage to her brain, but her mind remained sharp enough to understand what she was being told. When they showed her photographs of the objects found in the boxes, she studied them with trembling hands, searching desperately for anything that belonged to her children. But she recognized nothing. The objects were not from 1987. They were older, some much older, spanning what forensic analysis would eventually determine to be over 50 years. And that realization opened a door to possibilities that made even seasoned investigators feel cold, despite the summer heat. The leather journal found in the first box proved to be the key that began unlocking the mystery, though what it revealed was almost harder to accept than continued ignorance. Lisa Mendoza spent 2 weeks using specialized techniques to make the faded ink visible enough to read. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, belonging to someone who took their time forming each letter. The entries were dated, starting in June of 1959 and ending abruptly in August of that same year. The journal belonged to a girl named Patricia Hollis, age 12, who had attended Camp Whispering Pines during its 7th summer of operation. Her entries began normally enough, documenting activities and new friendships, complaints about mosquitoes and enthusiasm for swimming in the lake. But as the summer progressed, the tone of her writing shifted, becoming increasingly uneasy, describing sensations and experiences that seemed to disturb her in ways she could not quite articulate. She wrote about feeling watched in the forest, about finding strange symbols carved into trees that the counselors insisted were just natural patterns in the bark, about dreams where she walked through the woods at night, though she knew she had been in her cabin the whole time. And finally, in her last entry dated August 11th, 1959, she wrote something that made everyone who read it feel their skin prickle with an instinctive dread. "I think the forest has rules we don't know about. Tommy Brenner found the circle yesterday, past the old lookout tower. He said we should go back tonight after everyone is asleep, see what happens if we stand in the middle of it. But I don't want to. Something about it feels wrong, like a door we shouldn't open. But he won't listen. He says I'm being scared for no reason. Maybe he's right. Maybe I will write more tomorrow after we go. Maybe there's nothing to worry about." There were no more entries. Patricia Hollis had never written in her journal again. But according to camp records that investigators dug out of storage, Patricia had completed her summer at Whispering Pines and returned home to Bend, Oregon without incident. The records showed nothing unusual, no reported disappearances or problems during the 1959 season. Except when investigators tried to track down Patricia Hollis as an adult, they discovered something impossible. She did not exist beyond the age of 12. No high school records, no driver's license, no social security activity, no marriage certificate, no death certificate. Patricia Hollis had attended camp in 1959, returned home in August, and then vanished from all documentation as if she had never existed in the first place. Tommy Brenner, the boy mentioned in her final entry, had suffered the same fate. According to his family, who investigators located living in Eugene, Tommy had come home from camp acting strangely, withdrawn and prone to staring into empty spaces, as if seeing things no one else could perceive. His parents had assumed it was just the adjustment of returning to normal life. But 3 weeks after coming home, Tommy had walked out of his house one morning and never returned. His disappearance was reported, searched, and eventually classified as a runaway case. His family never saw him again. The investigation expanded rapidly, pulling in resources from state and federal agencies. Historians were consulted, genealogists brought in to trace families, records searched going back to the camp's founding in 1952. Then slowly, painfully, a pattern began to emerge that was almost too terrible to accept. Over the course of 35 years, from 1952 to 1987, at least 18 children had gone missing in connection with Camp Whispering Pines. Not all at once, not in ways that triggered major investigations, but spread out over the decades in a pattern so subtle it had gone unnoticed. A child who supposedly ran away. A teenager who left home and was assumed to have started a new life elsewhere. Disappearances that happened weeks or months after camp ended, too distant to be connected, too scattered to reveal the truth. But the objects in the buried boxes belonged to these children, and forensic analysis matched them to missing person reports, to family photographs, to records of lives that had been cut short or erased entirely. The boxes were not graves, but something else entirely, something that suggested a purpose no one wanted to contemplate. They were collections, carefully curated and preserved, marking something that had been taken and never returned. The circle that Patricia Hollis had written about became the focus of an intensive search. Teams combed the area around the old lookout tower, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, searching for anything that matched her description. For 2 weeks they found nothing, and some investigators began to wonder if the circle had been a product of a child's imagination, a scary story that had grown in the telling. Then a botanist brought in to survey the area noticed something unusual. There was a section of forest where the trees grew in a distinctly different pattern, forming a nearly perfect ring roughly 30 feet in diameter. The trees within the circle were younger than those surrounding it, suggesting that something had killed the original growth decades ago and new trees had taken their place. But stranger still, the species were wrong. Douglas fir grew naturally in this region, but the trees inside the circle were lodgepole pine, a species that should not thrive at this elevation and in this soil composition. When investigators began excavating the center of the circle, they found something that should not have been there. Stone, massive blocks of it, arranged in a pattern that suggested human construction despite being buried beneath 6 feet of earth and overgrowth. The stones were not native to the area, their composition matching granite found over 200 miles away in the Cascade Range. And they were old, far older than the camp, older than the town of Pine Ridge, older than anyone could properly date without extensive analysis. The arrangement was deliberate, forming a circular pattern with channels cut into the stone that might have been decorative or might have served some functional purpose. But most disturbing were the markings carved into the granite, symbols that resembled no known language or decorative tradition. Archaeologists were consulted, then anthropologists, then specialists in ancient cultures and pre-Columbian history. None could identify the symbols with certainty, though several noted similarities to protection wards found in various indigenous traditions, that symbols meant to contain or repel something dangerous. But there was disagreement about whether the symbols were meant to keep something out or keep something in, and that disagreement would prove to be crucial, because as the excavation continued, workers began experiencing phenomena that had no rational explanation. Tools went missing and reappeared in different locations. Batteries drained instantly in cameras and flashlights, even fresh ones just removed from packages. Workers reported feeling intensely watched, experiencing sudden drops in temperature, despite the summer heat, hearing voices that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. 3 workers quit within a week, refusing to return no matter how much they were paid. 1. A normally skeptical equipment operator named Frank Delgado submitted his resignation in person to Sheriff Kovacs, his hands shaking as he spoke. He described waking in his motel room at 3 in the morning to find a child's handprint on the window, small and perfect, pressed against the glass from the outside, even though his room was on the 2nd floor. He had packed his belongings and driven away before sunrise, and nothing could convince him to return. The investigation stalled as officials debated what to do. The stone structure was clearly significant, potentially even historically important, but it was also clearly connected to the disappearances in ways that made everyone uneasy. Some argued for complete excavation and documentation, and others wanted to rebury it immediately, seal it, and forbid anyone from disturbing the site again. While they debated, a graduate student in anthropology named Michael Torres, who had been brought in to help document the symbols, made a discovery that changed everything. He had been photographing the markings in sequence, trying to determine if they told a story or served as instructions. And when he arranged the photographs in the order the symbols appeared around the circle, he realized they did form a narrative of sorts, though not in any language he recognized. But the symbols themselves were not what caught his attention. It was the spaces between them, the intentional gaps in the carved stone. Michael noticed that dirt had accumulated in these gaps over the years, and when he carefully brushed it away, he found that the gaps themselves formed shapes. Letters, modern English letters, carved much more recently than the ancient symbols, shallow enough that they had filled with soil and become invisible unless you knew to look for them. The letters spelled out names, dozens of them, carved into the spaces between the ancient symbols like annotations in a book, like signatures on a document. And Michael recognized some of them immediately, because he had been reviewing the missing person files. Patricia Hollis, Tommy Brenner, the names from the 1950s and 60s, from the 70s and 80s, all the way up to Thomas and Elizabeth Hartley, that carved in letters that looked fresh enough to have been made yesterday despite being 30 years old. But there were other names too, ones that did not appear in any missing person reports. Names that predated the camp entirely, going back to the 1920s and 30s, back to when Pine Ridge was barely more than a logging outpost and the forest was largely unmapped. How many children had been lost to whatever this place represented? How far back did the pattern go? Sheriff Kovacs made the decision to excavate further, to expose the entire stone structure and document everything they found. It took another 2 weeks of careful work, but eventually they revealed the full extent of what had been hidden beneath the forest floor. The circular stone platform was roughly 40 feet in diameter, with the channels cut into its surface meeting at a central point where a depression had been deliberately carved. The depression was roughly 6 feet deep and perfectly circular, its walls smooth as if shaped by water over centuries. And at the bottom of the depression they found bones, not scattered or broken, but arranged in a pattern that suggested ritual purpose, intention. Small bones, belonging to animals based on initial examination. Birds, rabbits, squirrels, arranged in spirals that led to the center point. And at the very center, sealed in a stone box barely larger than a human hand, they found something that made even experienced forensic specialists hesitate before touching it. A single tooth. Human, belonging to a child approximately 10 to 12 years old based on development markers. DNA analysis would later confirm it did not match Thomas or Elizabeth Hartley, nor any of the other missing children whose families had provided samples. It was older than that, much older, preserved in a way that suggested intentional care rather than accidental survival. The question that haunted everyone was simple and terrible. What had happened here? What was this place? And most importantly, what had been done to the children whose names were carved into the stone? Janet Hartley died on October 3, 2017, never knowing the full truth of what had been discovered. Her heart simply stopped during the night, worn out from decades of grief and hoping, her last thoughts surely of the children she had never stopped searching for. She was buried between 2 empty graves marked with the names of Thomas and Elizabeth, her tombstone bearing an inscription that broke hearts even among strangers who read it. Together again. But the investigation continued without her, driven now by a determination to understand not just what had happened to the Hartley twins, but to all the children who had been lost over the decades. Federal agents took over the case, bringing resources and expertise that the small Pine Ridge department could never match. The site was sealed and studied, every inch documented, every symbol photographed and analyzed by experts from a dozen different fields. Then, in December of 2017, a retired forest ranger named Douglas Webb contacted the FBI with information he had kept secret for over 40 years. He was 81 years old, dying of lung cancer, and said he wanted to clear his conscience before he met his maker. What he revealed cast the entire investigation in a new and horrifying light. In 1976, while patrolling the area around Camp Whispering Pines, Douglas had encountered a man in the forest late at night, miles from any trail or road. The man had been carrying a shovel and a canvas bag, walking with clear purpose toward the area where the stone circle would later be discovered. Douglas had challenged him, demanding to know what he was doing so far from civilization at midnight. The man had smiled, Douglas remembered, a smile that never reached his eyes. He introduced himself as William Foster and claimed he was doing survey work for the Forestry Service, checking soil samples and tree health. He had documentation that seemed legitimate, and Douglas, young and inexperienced, had accepted the explanation and moved on. But William Foster did not work for the Forestry Service. There was no record of anyone by that name in any official capacity. And the canvas bag he had been carrying almost certainly contained objects belonging to children who had gone missing, items he was bringing to bury in one of the boxes scattered throughout the forest. More importantly, William Foster was the uncle of Gerald Foster, the camp director who had run Whispering Pines from 1969 to 1987, and the camp director who had been cleared of suspicion, who had passed polygraph tests, who had seemed genuinely devastated by the disappearance of the Hartley twins. The connection changed everything. Investigators reopened every aspect of Gerald Foster's life, examining it with the kind of scrutiny that comes only with hindsight and new evidence. And slowly, carefully, they began to piece together a picture that was almost too dark to comprehend. Gerald Foster had inherited the camp from his uncle William in 1969, but though the transfer had been described as a purchase rather than inheritance to avoid certain legal complications, William had run the camp from 1952 to 1969, the entire first phase of its operation, at the period when Patricia Hollis and Tommy Brenner had attended, when the pattern of disappearances had begun. But William Foster had not simply been running a summer camp. He had been using it as a hunting ground, selecting children based on criteria no one fully understood, marking them in ways that ensured they would return to the forest even after camp ended, drawn by compulsions they could not explain or resist. The boxes buried throughout the forest were not just collections but markers, but ritual sites where he performed acts that investigators could only partially reconstruct from the evidence. And when William had grown too old to continue, he had passed the operation to his nephew, teaching Gerald the rituals, the symbols, the methods of selection and manipulation. Gerald had continued his uncle's work for another 18 years, maintaining the cycle, feeding something that existed in that stone circle, as something that demanded regular offerings of innocence and youth. But what had they been feeding? What lived in that circle, or beneath it, or existed in some space that the circle connected to? This was the question that divided investigators, because the evidence suggested something that modern rational minds struggled to accept. The ancient symbols were real, carved by people who understood forces that civilization had forgotten or chosen to ignore. The stone circle was not just a structure but a threshold, a place where boundaries grew thin between what was and what should not be. The children had not simply been murdered. They had been given to something, offered up in exchange for benefits that William and Gerald Foster had received over the decades. The camp had never failed financially, even during economic downturns that destroyed similar businesses. Neither man had ever suffered serious illness or injury. They had lived charmed lives built on the suffering of innocence, sustained by bargains made with something that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. Gerald Foster was arrested on November 8, 2017, at his retirement home in Salem. He was 73 years old, suffering from dementia that may have been genuine or may have been performed for sympathy. He refused to speak to investigators, sitting in interview rooms with a slight smile on his face, saying nothing, offering no defense, no explanation, no remorse. But in his home, investigators found journals dating back to 1969, meticulously documenting every child he had selected, every ritual he had performed, and every object he had buried in the forest. The journals were written in a mixture of English and the same unknown symbols found on the stone circle, as if he had been learning a language that should never be spoken aloud. And they found something else, something that made even federal agents pause. A map identical to the one found beneath Cabin 7's foundation, except this one had additional markings, X symbols beyond the dozen that had already been discovered. At least 20 more locations scattered throughout the forest, places that had not yet been excavated, boxes that still waited beneath the earth. The question that haunted everyone was simple. Had the map beneath Cabin 7 been left deliberately, a confession of sorts, planted where it would eventually be discovered? Or had Gerald Foster made a mistake, buried something that was meant to remain with him, creating the breadcrumb that would eventually lead to his exposure? Teams excavated the new locations over the following months, finding boxes just like the others, containing objects and memories that belonged to children who had been erased from proper documentation. But in 3 of the locations they found something different. Bones, small and carefully arranged, belonging to children who had not simply disappeared but had died in the forest and been buried in secret. DNA testing identified 2 of the remains. One belonged to a boy named Jacob Miller, reported as a runaway in 1963. The other belonged to a girl named Hannah Price, who had supposedly moved to California with her family in 1971, though no records of that family existed beyond their departure from Oregon. But the third set of remains could not be identified. They belonged to a child approximately 10 years old, and they were over 100 years old, predating the camp, predating William Foster, predating the modern history of Pine Ridge entirely. Someone had been using that stone circle for far longer than anyone had imagined, feeding something that had existed in those woods since long before the trees grew tall. But Gerald Foster died in custody on March 17, 2018, before his trial could begin. The official cause was heart failure, sudden and unexpected. But the guard on duty that night reported something strange. He said Foster had been lying on his bunk smiling at the ceiling and had spoken just before he died, 3 words repeated over and over in a whisper. And the circle remains. Meso. Boom. The stone structure was studied for another year, then quietly reburied by order of federal authorities who seemed uncomfortable with the implications of leaving it exposed. The area was declared environmentally protected, access forbidden to the public, monitored by cameras and occasional patrols. The official explanation cited sensitive archaeological remains and endangered species habitat. But the real reason was simpler and more disturbing. During the year the circle remained exposed, 3 more children went missing in Oregon, all within 50 miles of Pine Ridge, all under circumstances that echoed the historical pattern. Their families reported the same details. Strange behavior after camping trips, talking about dreams where they walked through dark forests, an overwhelming compulsion to return to places they could not quite remember. One child was found delirious and dehydrated, 3 miles from the excavation site, unable to explain how she had gotten there or why she had left her home in the middle of the night. Another was never seen again. The third was discovered at the edge of the buried stone circle, standing in the exact center of where the depression had been, though the site had been filled in and covered weeks before. When officers asked the child, a 9-year-old boy named Lucas Rivera, what he was doing there, he looked at them with eyes that seemed too old for his face and said something that made grown men feel cold. Someone called my name. They said I was supposed to come here, but they said it was my turn. Lucas was taken to a hospital, evaluated by psychiatrists, and eventually returned to his family. But he never spoke normally again, lapsing into long silences broken by whispers in a language no one recognized, drawing symbols that matched those found on the ancient stones, symbols he could not possibly have seen or learned. The FBI concluded its investigation in 2019, filing reports that were immediately classified as their contents sealed for reasons of national security or public safety or some other bureaucratic excuse that meant the truth would remain hidden from people who deserved to know it. The official story released to the press was sanitized, describing Gerald and William Foster as serial predators who had used the camp to access victims, with no mention of stone circles or ancient symbols or things that existed in the spaces between rational explanation. But the families knew differently. The investigators knew differently. And the forest knew differently, keeping its secrets the way forests always do, patient and silent and waiting. Camp Whispering Pines remains abandoned, the property unsold despite multiple attempts to develop it. Workers refuse to clear the land, equipment fails mysteriously, and investors back out of deals for reasons they cannot quite articulate. The old cabins have collapsed into rotting heaps, and the forest has reclaimed the trails, erasing the paths where children once walked safely between the trees. Sometimes, hikers who venture too close to the area report strange experiences, electronics failing suddenly, the sensation of being watched by eyes they cannot locate, voices in the distance that sound like children laughing, though no children are anywhere nearby. Most dismiss these experiences as imagination or natural phenomena, the wind playing tricks, the forest doing what forests do. But there are others who believe something different, who understand that some places hold darkness that cannot be explained away or paved over or forgotten. They believe the stone circle still exists beneath the earth, still functions according to rules older than civilization, still waits for offerings that something continues to demand. The Hartley twins were never found, not their bodies, not their bones, not any conclusive evidence of what happened to them on that June afternoon in 1987. Their names remain carved in stone beneath 6 feet of earth and overgrowth, part of a list that stretches back generations, little record of children who walked into the forest and never walked out, who were taken by something that wore the face of summer camp and wholesome outdoor activities and innocent adventure. Janet Hartley rests between 2 empty graves, her epitaph a prayer that was never answered in life but perhaps was answered in death. And somewhere in the forest outside Pine Ridge, Oregon, the trees stand watch over secrets that should never be disturbed, over circles that should never be entered, over names that should never be called in the darkness between sunset and dawn. The investigation is officially closed. But the forest remains open, and the circle beneath it remains intact, and somewhere in the space between memory and nightmare, the children continue to wait, their voices carried on wind that whispers through branches, their names carved in stone that no amount of time will ever fully erase. This is the story of Thomas and Elizabeth Hartley, who disappeared from summer camp in 1987 and were never seen again. But it is also the story of Patricia Hollis and Tommy Brenner, of Jacob Miller and Hannah Price, of Lucas Rivera, who came too close to something he should never have found, and of dozens more whose names we will never know, whose families never got closure, whose fates remain mysteries wrapped in darkness too terrible to fully comprehend. The map was found. The boxes were excavated. The circle was exposed and studied and reburied. But the truth, the real truth, the final answer to what happened to those children, remains hidden in the forest, in the stone, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And in Pine Ridge, Oregon, when the sun sets and shadows grow long beneath the trees, parents still tell their children to stay close, stay safe, and never ever wander into the forest alone. Because some places never forget what they have taken, and some hungers never sleep, no matter how much time passes or how deeply the evidence is buried. And the circle remains. And it waits, patient as stones, silent as graves, hungry as it has always been, for the next child who hears their name called from beneath the trees, the next innocent who walks into the forest searching for adventure and finds something far darker waiting in the shadows. This is where the story ends, but the mystery continues, because some questions have no answers that living minds can safely comprehend, and some truths are better left buried beneath the earth where they belong.